Hello and welcome to the Cool Farm Alliance annual conference in this new format for coronavirus where we're all online. Thank you very much for joining us. So I'm Richard Proffitt, I'm the General Manager of the Cool Farm Alliance. And today we'll hear a range of stories around the Cool Farm Alliance from users and members of the Alliance. And I'll take you through the agenda shortly. Before I did, there was a couple of housekeeping rules that I wanted to take you through. And I have an ably assisted by Michaela Ashbacher, our membership manager, who is going to pop up the slides in a minute.
So I start the slides, right? Is that okay?
Yes, please. And the housekeeping slide, please, Michaela. Thank you. So we have many people on the webinar, and we are also streaming to YouTube. So if we can ask, we've silenced everyone's microphone except for the panelists who are going to be presenting. But as we go through the presentation, you'll notice on your screens there is a Q&A box. And what we would ask is for you to type Q&A or questions that you may have for any of our panelists or any comments that you might want to make. And as we go through the presentations, we'll endeavour to answer them, or we will also have a Q&A session at the end of this session where we will get through as many of the questions as we can in the time. With the questions, once a question has been created, there is a tick, a sort of thumbs up box if you wanted to promote that question, if it reflects a thought that you've got and you want to promote it up the list. And those with the most likes will go to the top of the list and will be the ones we will address in the Q&A session. What we will also do after this session is follow up and attempt to answer as many of the questions as possibly, and we will post those somewhere probably on our website so that everyone can have access to the questions and answers as well. Also through the session, we're going to have some polling questions to elicit some feedback from you. So when we pop them up, you'll have the opportunity to answer those questions. So please do participate in that. And also finally, in addition to the streaming to YouTube, we also will be recording the session. And again, we'll find a way to make that available to participants later. With that, I would like to hand over to Andre Etner, the Vice Chairman of our Executive Committee, for a welcome. Next slide, Daniel. Michaela, please.
Great. Thank you, Rich. Thanks, everyone. It's great to see some familiar faces already. And I hear we have a large group of participants today. Welcome to this year's virtual AGM of the Cool Farm Alliance on behalf of the Executive Committee and the Secretariat. My name is Andre Eitner. I'm Sustainable Agriculture Manager at PepsiCo, and today I'm here in my role as the Vice Chair of the Executive Committee to welcome you all. Before I do that, can I just really take a moment and thank Richard, Daniella, and the entire team who pivoted us due to coronavirus from a physical meeting here in the UK to a virtual, the first ever virtual meeting of the Cool Farm Alliance at this scale. So thank you very much indeed, team, for pulling this together. These are indeed challenging times, and you know, I feel like the race to shape the world after this crisis has already started, and the outcome is anything but certain. But there are also new opportunities emerging, like, for example, this virtual conference. Last year in Cambridge, we had around 100 participants, and I was informed just before this we kicked off that for today's call, we had 450 plus participants registered around the world. So this really creates an opportunity for virtual global community around the Cool Farm tool. And that, to me, in my decade with the organization, has been always almost as valuable as the tool itself, is to really have this group of like-minded sustainability practitioners dedicated, and jointly we can shape the decade of action ahead. The momentum that we will hear today about of the Cool Farm Alliance continued to really build last year. We will hear an update on the Cool Farm agenda for 2020 and the longer term strategy, some really exciting developments here. We will hear case studies of how people are using the Cool Farm tool in their own supply chains to drive real impact on the ground. And we will hear a presentation from Syngenta and their take on the future of farming and the question of whether a revolution might be needed. Before I close, I think it's times like these really in which member-driven organizations like the Cool Farm Alliance can really come into their own, bring people together and jointly shape the sustainable agriculture agenda for the next decade. And the Cool Farm Alliance is exceptionally well positioned to play a leading role in this struggle, and I couldn't be more excited about you all joining us today. Thank you very much. Over to you, Richard.
Thank you, Andre. So Andre's sort of covered the agenda. Next slide, please, Michaela. But just to give you an idea of the timings that we're working through. So in a minute, I'm going to ask Daniella Malin, our Deputy General Manager, to take you through an overview of the Cool Farm Alliance and our sort of vision and purpose, followed by which we're going to hear from Jake Freestone, a farmer and his experience with regenerative agriculture. And that's a super exciting story. Followed by that, Richard Burkinshaw, one of the advisors to the Cool Farm Alliance, will be providing a demonstration of the Cool Farm tool and how it can work in practice. Following which at 3 o'clock, we will hear from a range of our members, some exciting stories around how they're applying the Cool Farm tool within their network systems and supply chain. And then finally at 4 o'clock, we're going to hear from Dave Hughes from Syngenta with a view and perspective on the future foresight and future farming and whether and to what extent a revolution is needed in agriculture for the coming decade. And finally, we will have a Q&A session before we hopefully timely wrap up for 4:30. So thank you for that. And I will just hand over to Daniella in a moment. But before I do, we're really interested into who you all are that are out there watching this webinar. So we'd like to actually do 2 of our first polls with you now, just to kind of get a sense check and a quick pulse as to where you're coming from and where you see potential interest in the Cool Farm tool and Cool Farm Alliance and how you might want to use it. So Daniella, could we launch the first poll?
The first poll is launched. And just to let you know that I will also stop it afterwards. So I think you will give everybody a little bit of time to respond to those questions, right? Yeah. Just let me know when I should.
Yeah, I can't see it, but
no, exactly.
I'm assuming everyone else out there can.
Yes, and I just wanted to add also something because we have also some viewers on YouTube because we are live streaming this session as well. So if there are more people that want to join and just view in, then they can not unfortunately see that poll. So for those viewers, unfortunately this doesn't work out. Yeah.
Michaela, can you relaunch the poll because all the comments coming through on the Q&A is that no one can see it.
Okay, I just saw that one person started it. Just a second. I relaunched it.
Yeah,
now it's relaunched.
Okay, great. Thank you for your patience, folks. Please have a go and tell us where you're coming from in question 1 and question 2, where your interests may lie. Thank you.
Answers come in, so it should work. So it's working great. We're getting like 65% already. People answered already to the questions. Let's give it a little bit more time. And it's very nice for me as a viewer. I can see exactly what is happening, but in shortly I will share the poll also with everybody.
So we'll give it another 30 seconds or so. We've had 245 of you register your vote already, so just a few more seconds.
Exactly. So if you can round up your votes, do that now. And then we're going to stop the poll and share the results with you.
Share the results as well.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
So I'm going to end the poll. Thanks for joining, and then we can share the results with everybody. So you should have them now on your screen. Richard, can you see them, or should
I can? No, I can see them. I'm assuming everyone else can too. So predominantly from Europe and then followed by North America, but we have a smattering of people. Lovely to see you from Africa and South Asia and South America as well. No one from East Asia, but then I suppose it's probably quite late in East Asia at the moment. And then in terms of interest in the Alliance, we've got supply chain actors wishing to embed sustainability within the supply chain. And we also have a range from farmers looking at sustainable agriculture, agricultural companies, ag consultants, few people working in the finance sector, fair few research academics and NGOs. And also a range of other that don't classify within that list. So thank you very much for participating, and that's very, very helpful for us. So we can stop sharing that, Michaela, and with that, I will hand over to Daniella. Thank you very much.
Great, welcome everyone. So exciting to be gathered here with you. You can go to the next slide, Michaela. The mission of the Cool Farm Alliance is to enable millions of growers around the world to make more informed on-farm decisions that reduce their environmental impact. One of the things to take away from this slide and that might jump out right away is scale. So from the get-go, the Cool Farm tool was designed and built for scale and to be usable, applicable globally around the world on all major crops and livestock. In fact, the origins of the Cool Farm tool actually came from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the estimates of climate change mitigation potential available through agriculture. How could that mitigation potential be realized if there wasn't a way for buyers and suppliers within global supply chains to actually have a conversation with each other about current agricultural practices on any individual farm or field relative to what could be and what that mitigation potential might look like on an individual field, given the soil characteristics and the climate conditions and the considerations of that farm business. So that was the launch idea for a tool that could actually create this basis for a conversation around current agricultural practices and what could be, and then focus the attention on the gap between those and what it would take to close that gap, what it would take to move current practice to the kinds of practices that would actually both mitigate climate change and be beneficial and economically profitable for the farmer. So the underlying principles of the Cool Farm tool are that this interactivity, this ability to put in management practices. The Cool Farm tool is designed to be farmer focused in that management sensitive way, and that in that way to build literacy throughout the supply chain around the relationship between agriculture and climate change. To have a tool that actually does all this to build literacy in the supply chain isn't in itself what we're actually after. The goal and the vision is to actually be able to realize all that mitigation potential and to enable agriculture as a sector to become a carbon sink, to absorb more carbon than is emitted. That brings us to the vision that you're seeing on the screen now. So if we do that, we would see a global food system that builds soil carbon, helps to mitigate climate change, and restores ecological balance. One of the things that's so exciting about this particular line of work is that a lot of the practices, and we're going to hear about this in Jake's presentation in a little bit, that mitigate climate change are also set in motion some virtuous cycles. Good for biodiversity, good for water retention, water infiltration, other co-benefits that also come with climate change mitigation. So the Cool Farm Tool has evolved into being a multi-metric tool as well. Let's go on to the next slide, and I'll just talk through the pathways of work that the Cool Farm Alliance sees within its purview. So obviously, maintaining, continuing to develop and build the Cool Farm Tool, continuing to improve the usability, making it easier to use, more intuitive, more informative, more engaging, and more functional at catalyzing action is constantly within our purview. Also constantly seeing to the accuracy and precision, seeing what we can do to shrink the uncertainties of the quantification engine itself. So always looking to further enhance the metrics, the underlying metrics itself, the usability and the accessibility of the Cool Farm Tool. The other line of work for the Cool Farm Alliance is the engagement and the outreach. So having a great tool is one thing, having a community around it that actually uses the tool and it can take advantage of that literacy building capacity to manage greenhouse gases and other sustainable agriculture indicators in supply chains. That's where the gold really is. But even those two alone, the outreach and engagement and a high quality tool, don't in itself bring us to the vision described. So for that, we also need to look at what are the other enabling conditions that need to be put in place around deploying the Cool Farm Tool, around managing greenhouse gases and sustainable agriculture. We know that just a procurement ask may not be enough. So what are the other conditions that need to be in place? Is it more economic modeling of the co-benefits between mitigation and farm economics? Is it farmer to farmer training? Is it learning from the innovators? Or is it more agronomists trained in cover cropping and soil building characteristics? What are the other enabling conditions? And crucially, one of the most exciting developments that a lot of people are pressing forward in are incentives. So financial incentives. Can carbon can we pay for carbon and other ecosystem services? And would that really help to enable this change? These three arenas hopefully help you to see what it is about the work that you're doing that is part of this larger, that we're all working on together here to help bring agriculture into a carbon sink and what it is about the alliance that can support your objectives. So let's move to the next slide. The Cool Farm Alliance and Cool Farm Tool has been building for quite some time. What you're seeing here is the current members and partners of the Alliance. So really excited that we're starting to reach critical mass, and a lot of the numbers of members have been increasing more rapidly. We invite all of you to join in this and also join us as members. You can move to the next slide after people have had a chance to see those a little bit. So who would you encounter when you come to the Cool Farm Alliance? This is just a look at the governance structure and who's all involved. So we are guided by our committee, our executive committee, Haugen-Kozyra, Global Sustainability Director at Unilever, Tiffany Stephanie at Fertilizers Europe, Graham Miller at Syngenta, John Hillier at University of Edinburgh, and you just heard from Andre Edner. They guide us, the Secretariat. We are the management team. So you heard from Richard Prophet and Daniella Malin, the Deputy General Manager. We are joined now by Claire Lewis, who is our Development Operations Manager. So looking after the tool itself, the Cool Farm tool, and Michaela Ashbasher, our new membership manager. Ben Kayetz wrote our water metric and is seeing to the methodology of the tool, maintaining that methodology and its documentation. We're so glad to be also joined by our advisors, Richard Heathcott, Richard Burkinshaw, who you'll hear from in a little bit, and Simon Miller and Sarah Wynn, who looks after our dairy and beef working group. You can go to the next slide. So this is just an overview of where the Cool Farm tool operates. So you see the darkest boxes are the most mature parts of the software. So the crop pathway, which has greenhouse gases, water, and food loss and waste. The livestock pathway has the GHG metrics, water metrics not yet, food loss and waste not yet. The biodiversity metrics actually operate not on a crop basis, but on a whole farm basis, and it's available for temperate forest biomes. Mediterranean biodiversity is on its way, imminent, and tropical is following soon after that. The perennials pathway exists in a rudimentary manner in the Cool Farm tool, and we're in the midst of an upgrade for the perennials pathway, which will then also come with greenhouse gas, water, and food loss and waste. You can go to the next. The Cool Farm tool is now translated into 14 languages, and you can keep clicking through, Michaela, thank you. Each of the components of the Cool Farm tool are to different degrees wired up through APIs and in interoperability that way, so you can keep clicking through. So we have APIs at different levels of development for each of these pathways. And finally, this graphic shows you what are the management practices on the farm that that can be modeled in the Cool Farm tool. And we'll hear more about this in practical terms from Jake in a little bit. So you can see here things like efficiency of the irrigation, renewable energy, biodiversity, cover cropping practices, reduced tillage. All of these are the kinds of practices on the farm that the Cool Farm tool can model. Can go on. And finally, just a look at where the Cool Farm tool is used. So over 10,000 users now in the online tool. That's with the manual entry of data. We don't imagine that manual entry of data is the future of the Cool Farm tool. In fact, rather API integration. So integrating the Cool Farm tool through to farm management software is more likely where we will head and where we're expecting to see the largest growth. But currently still the manual entry is over 10,000 users, 40,000 assessments in 118 countries. We're going to turn now to Jake Freestone. Thank you so much, Jake, for joining us. And we're going to hear a little bit about what regenerative agriculture is looking like on his farm. Looking forward to your story. Thank you, Jake.
Yeah, Daniela, thank you very much indeed for that. I hope everybody can hear me okay, and you can see my little face on your screen. So I want to talk to you a little bit about our regenerative agriculture story here at Overbury. We are in the southwest or West Midlands of the UK. First slide, please, Michaela. This is our main introduction. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the farm, what we do, what we crop, who I am. Next slide. And then we want to talk a little bit about regenerative agriculture and the carbon story at Overbury. And it is a great story. It's a very positive story, which in these times is, I think, particularly important. We have a great opportunity within agriculture to be able to do that. So next slide, and then the quick intro time. So next slide. So this is me, I'm Jake. I've been the farm manager at Overbury since 2003. I had a time with Velport, a farm management company, before coming here. and I don't come from a farming background. My parents are teachers, and I got the farming bug from my godfather. The farm is a leaf demonstration farm, leaf being linking environment and farming. And those two things go hand in hand, and I will also put food in there as well now. We have a brilliant opportunity to showcase what we're doing. There's a lot going on here. We have open days, 2,500 people a year have been around the farm some years. We take part in Open Farm Sunday, and that's a really positive story to be able to be part of. So next slide, please. The farm is about 1,600 hectares. It's a really mixed farm. So the picture you see up here is on Cotswold brash soil, 1,000 foot above sea level. Very, very thin soils, very high pH, nutrient lockup, and we have moisture retention issues, and soil management is really, really crucial to our whole system of food production here. We grow milling wheat, malting barley, oilseed rape, peas, beans, linseed, and that variety of crops is really, really important. We have about 700 mil of rain every year, and we also have 1,000 ewes, which are outdoor lambing at the moment on our permanent grass. So it's a really interesting, very varied farm with a bit of sand and gravel land, some Cotswold brash and lias clay, some vegetable production as well. Next slide, please. This is where it all started for me and our journey into regenerative agriculture. I did a Nuffield farming scholarship in 2013, breaking the wheat yield plateau in the UK. And my conclusions came back to the fact that we have been mismanaging our soils for a long, long time. And this was Oklahoma, this picture, where I went to visit the Noble Foundation, and Lloyd Noble in 1913, so over 100 years ago, stated that the land must continue to provide our food, our clothing, and our shelter long after the oil is gone. And I find that really, really important statement now more than any other time with the coronavirus and things like that going around. Food is crucial, but so is the environment. Next slide, please. So in Oklahoma, this was, again, the light bulb moment. This is what set the scene for me to try and take our journey to regenerative agriculture to hand. Two soils managed very, very differently, just the other side of a fence after 2 inches of rain. The ones on the left of the screen, dark soil, rich in organic matter, lovely crop residue behind, and they can grow crops into that soil. On the right-hand side, no soil structure. When it rained, that water, that rainfall just disappeared, blew away. And that to me is the difference between cropping and no cropping. So this is really that message, if you like, that I want to move along to. So if we move on to regenerative agriculture, three main elements, and the next slide as well, Michaela. So we've got minimising soil disturbance, absolutely crucial to how we manage the farm here on our slopes, keeping the soil covered, keep pressing, Michaela, and also long and diverse rotations as well. So if we take that first one, minimising soil disturbance, next slide, please. We can then talk a little bit about our no-till farming system, if you like. And this is where
interrupt real quick, Jake, just to say to everyone on the call, Jake may not be able to be with us for the whole call afterwards. So please put all your questions in now, and we will try to handle them right when he's finished talking. So just feel free to keep your questions coming. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent. So yeah, so this is where it all starts for me and the farm here. It's a systems approach, and no-till is so important. It has so many benefits, from improving soil health, and this is talking insects, worms, organic matter, carbon. We're increasing water infiltration. We're increasing our farm machinery efficiencies. We're reducing our costs, and we'll come on to that in a short while. Reducing fuel use, again, reducing the amount of carbon that we're putting into the atmosphere and actually locking it away in the soil. And there's a lot of extra skills involved in this, some of which a lot of people don't have. So where people can help is with support and education, and trying to move away from maybe traditional types of agriculture. But it's not just about the no-till drill. There's a whole raft of additional implementations that you need to do to be able to farm in this particular way. Next slide, please. And the environment is so important where we're producing our food. So we're building a home for that wider soil microbiology, earthworms. We're getting more beneficial insects in our soils. We're getting rove beetles and more worms, which we never used to see before when we were cultivating them. And that worm population is crucial for returning soil organic matter back, returning crop residue into nutrients that our plants can actually utilize and take up. So we're worm counting. We're looking for sort of 400 worms per square metre. And actually on our thin Cotswold brash soils, these soils are actually responding really quickly to this particular method of farming. But we're also not using insecticides, and we're trying to reduce our fungicide input as well. And these are all having a knock-on effect to our actual biodiversity around the whole farm. Next slide, please. And we need to keep the soil covered, absolutely crucial. This year, more than anything, we've gone from a really wet time to quite a dry spell of weather now, which is great for cracking on and planting. But these soils are drying out really, really quickly. And where we have cover crops still in place, there's still moisture in the ground. So these cover crops are helping us do a whole range of different benefits, feeding the microbiology. We're actually finding pollinators around on flowering cover crops in November. And that's things that we never really saw before when we were in a cultivated system. We're capturing more nutrients, anywhere between 70 to 100 kilos of nitrogen are captured at the end of the winter. And that fertilizer, some of it's been regenerated from where we are planting legumes within our cover crops. But also a lot of that is being captured and therefore not being washed through the soil into the watercourses. So cover crops are actually crucial for maintaining that soil structure. And we like to plant on the green before we destroy them, so that those crops are still in place, still holding that soil structure together, which is absolutely crucial. That soil can be then kept cool or kept warm if it's covered. We've got some photographs of thermometers, kind of 10-15 degrees difference between bare crops and crops under and soil under cover crop. And that's really important for looking after that soil biology and keeping it functioning, which is really, really important. Next slide, please. So this is just a great graphic really about the differences that we can see in terms of carbon capture. And I know Richard's going to talk a lot about that on the studies that we've done here on our particular field. But actually water infiltration is also important. As I say, we farm on a hill. We've got very, very thin soils, and we can infiltrate up to 160 millimetres every hour through those particular soils. So that's a really great improvement in terms of how these soils are restructuring themselves. So we'll move on to the next slide, because this is also important. It's a 5-minute fallow. This is where we want to be to maximise the investment of the seed and the diesel by planting crops as soon as we can after the combine's been over the field. We're maximising soil temperature, day length, and there's always moisture around to get small seed established at that time of year. And if we're planting early, say beginning of August, we can be generating up to about an additional 5 tonnes a hectare of dry matter into these cover crops, which is actually quite a significant amount. And that cover, that protects the soil, stops the rain splash hitting the soil, and keeps the biology alive by pumping sugar down into the soil, helping feed those microbes. Absolutely important. And we're also looking at spinning cover crops in now before the combine goes through to try and grow even larger cover crops to capture more and more carbon that we possibly can. We're farmers at the end of the day. We turn sunlight into carbon. We either sell that carbon as a carbohydrate, as a food source, or we invest it into our soils. So next slide, please, Daniella. This is, again, one of our cover crops that we've grown, huge biodiversity in there. There's 5 or 6 different species there, some capturing nitrogen, some fixing nitrogen, some mineralizing phosphates from the soil, something like buckwheat. Flowers there available. This is the beginning of November. It's a great habitat for the wider biodiversity, both above ground and also under the soil as well. It's really, really important. And we're finding a lot more predators now than pests, which is helping to reduce our reliance on insecticides and slug pellets and things like that. It's also helping us reduce our purchased fertilizer, which again is really, really important. But if you can't grow cover crops or you don't feel you want to, then there are other ways to do that as well. Chopping straw rather than selling it, importing compost, chicken litter, green waste material. All these additions help feed the soil, capture carbon and help lock that away. Next slide, please. And then we move on to our rotation. So rotation, really, really important to have a mixture of cereals, brassicas, legumes, Lots of different seeding types, spring cropping, winter cropping, to reduce reliance on certain herbicides and help with resistance issues. And if you look closely, the bottom left-hand field, the field of wheat on here, is actually the field in question that Richard is going to be describing later on, to look at how the carbon balance within that field has changed since 2005 until 2019. Also, having a wider rotation reduces our marketing exposure as well. So we've got more crops in different pots. That enables us to spread that marketing risk. It spreads our machinery, spreads our harvesting pressure, yeah, all helps. Next slide, please. And with our sheep that we've got on the farm, we've got 1,100 ewes actually this year. It's usually 11 or 1,200, but these are actually the icing on the cake, if you like. These were used last February, grazing rye and vetch cover crop ahead of spring planting. And this has been a real addition to us in the fact that we can now overwinter our sheep outside in our arable fields. They are turning those crops round into organic matter very quickly, speeding up that availability of nutrients, mobile muck spreaders going around. It means we're not having to house the sheep, they're healthier outside. We're not buying hay, reducing our concentrates. The straw that we're producing in the arable department is being chopped and returned to the fields. So actually there's a lot of benefits on here. The grassland is being rested, so we're reducing our work burden. And that's absolutely important to have a more sustainable farming system, both for all of our different enterprises. Next slide, please. This is something we've been playing around with for a few years now. This is companion cropping in oilseed rape, which we've been doing since the neonicotine ban came in. Oilseed rape is a crop that's really under pressure. And even growing it how we're growing it, I'm not sure without some help there are ways to be able to keep growing this. So this was an oilseed rape companion crop mix with vetches, buckwheat, phacelia, and Burkinshaw clover in there, all planted at the same time. This was a shot taken at the end of September, planted on the 14th of August. And it's a great sort of biodiverse field, and that's really important. We've got flowering crops in there. We've got a lot of roots. We've got a lot of infiltration. We've got nitrogen capture, nitrogen fixation. We're getting some healthy rape plants there that are establishing really well. It's a masking for flea beetle, and I just hope that farming in with these sorts of techniques will be able to keep growing a sort of crop like that for as long as we possibly can. Next slide, please. And then we come down to economics, because at the end of the day, this is where the numbers kind of pan out. And this is our costings back from 2004 when we were in a plough-based system. Then we moved through different types of no-till, min-till, until we get to no-till at the bottom here, £52 a hectare to establish a crop. That's based on a crop that's been rolled as well. But not only is this reducing these initial costs, it's also helping reduce our capital investment in the business as well. So over the previous 5 years and the projected 10 years, we're looking to save about £270,000 worth of reduced capital in extra tractors, extra cultivation equipment, because we've switched into this type of farming. Our horsepower for the arable unit has gone down from 620 to 370 horsepower, so that's less diesel being used. We're now using 32% of the fuel that we've reduced by 32% the fuel use that we are putting through these tractors to get these crops growing. And that's some huge savings over time. Next slide, please. And time is also important to us. Okay, 2 clicks on, Michaela, that'd be good. Time is valuable, whether that is time to spend at home with your family or time to spend doing other things. This was in our cultivated farming system, it was taking us about 56 minutes on average to establish a crop of wheat, which within the hour is about 93%, which doesn't give you a lot of free time to do running or to go to the pub or to do whatever you want to do. And switching into min-till with another click of a button, that time has been drastically reduced. We're now averaging about 15 minutes a hectare to establish, or 18 minutes if we're rolling it as well. So that's freeing up a lot of extra time. It's freeing up a lot of opportunity as well. And as a result of doing this, we've been able to take on an additional contract farming agreement just down the road with another 260 hectares of arable work. So this is giving us flexibility and to be more accurate and to be more timely in terms of our opportunities and our projects. Final slide, or nearly final slide. So in summary, really, we're looking at a systems approach. It's the whole thing. You can't go no-tilling without cover crops. You can't do that without the rotation. If you can get livestock into that system, quick click of the button, Michaela, would be great. Livestock in there is actually the end goal if we can. It's maintaining a margin as well. We are always under pressure, being commodity growers, to look at the cost of production, and that is really, really important. No more so with changing climate and the pressures that we're being faced and we're being put under. It is an exciting way to farm. It is challenging. It is really, really interesting, and it's great to be learning new things every day. I do think there's an opportunity for future support under the agriculture bill for farming in this more sustainable manner and looking after our soil. Soil health is absolutely crucial, not just for the farm, but for the wider environment and what that can support. And also, finally, it really is about carbon capture. These soils are improving. Richard's going to go through one more quick slide. Click. Thank you. So carbon capture, absolutely crucial. You know, reducing our artificial inputs, trying to grow things at home. There's a lot of investment in the soil that we can actually use to increase our profitability. We're improving the water infiltration, which is reducing environmental erosion from our soils, which is really, really crucial. Increasing in organic matter. And actually, it's a really, something that we as a farm are really, really proud to be involved in, this kind of sustainable regenerative agriculture. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jake. We have questions pouring in. Let's take one or two, and then we'll go over to Richard. I think you're able to stay with us just through Richard's at least, so that allow the voting to continue.
Super. Yes, Jake, your presentation has certainly caused a stir. We've got lots and lots of questions. We won't get through them all, though, in this 5-minute session, but I believe Jake will be available to answer them all, and we'll return the answers in a written format later on. And he's also an ongoing ambassador of the CFA, so will be available in interviews and podcasts and different things going forward. Our highest voted question is about Jake's presentation. So will it be available after the event? And yes, it will. So we'll get that circulated as soon as we can. So on to our first real question for you, Jake. This is from Ben. How do you manage herbicide resistance under no-till systems? And what if glyphosate is banned?
Yeah, two real challenging questions there. Glyphosate, if glyphosate gets banned, and I know there are certain sectors that would wish to see it being banned, I think most agricultural systems are going to be in trouble. Those of you, and I can remember trying to get stale seed beds and spraying 2 or 3 small shots of glyphosate to try and kill those weeds off before we drilled, would be in a very similar sort of boat. We've been playing around with a few ideas, crimper rollers, rolling on frost, things like that, to try and kill weeds in that way. We haven't found a successful way of doing that that's reliable enough yet. And I think that's the challenge that we have as farmers. One thing will work one year, it might not work the next year. For instance, this year, trying to get on to roll cover crops with a Cambridge roller, with it being so wet and so little frost, you know, would have been impossible. So while we have glyphosate, we'll continue to use it. If and when it gets banned, we will have to go back to some kind of mechanical cultivation to remove those weeds, and that's going to undo all the benefits that we're going to hear about from Richard's talk a bit later on. And in terms of herbicide resistance, I think rotation is crucial to that. Some spring crops, some winter cropping, different herbicides that we use with different modes of action are absolutely imperative in terms of keeping that resistance to an absolute minimum.
Super. Next question. This is from somebody who wants to remain anonymous. Do you see an issue with potash availability in the long term with no-till? And how do you get potash down into the root zone to replace removal?
So I think the worms will also do a lot about moving not just potash, but all kinds of nutrients up and down through the system. Roots and biology are absolutely crucial to this. And one of the things I didn't really talk about too much was that biological element. We're looking at all sorts of interesting ways of trying to help the soil biology out, to be able to remove move nutrients around within the soil structure and in the rooting zone. Organic amendments are also crucial to that. So we've got a straw for muck deal with a neighbour. We're importing compost, we're importing chicken litter, which we're mixing with straw from our stud farm. So actually there's a lot of organic fertiliser methods that we can bring into the system and rely on that natural process of the earthworms building soil, really, to create that availability for the plant roots.
Okay. Wonderful. We're going to have to move on, but let's let the voting continue while Richard goes through his presentation. Hopefully we can take a couple more right at the end.
Jake, could you stop sharing now so that I can share mine, please? Thank you. Okay, so good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. I'm Richard Burkinshaw. I'm an advisor for the Cool Farm Alliance, but I'm also a user of the Cool Farm tool for over 10 years in my previous career in breakfast cereals, largely working in the arable domain. So now I work very much as an advisor for arable with Cool Farm and also in deployment and rolling this out into large farmer groups. Jake and I have been working together over the last few weeks, so our presentations are not only strongly linked, they are absolutely integrated. It's very hard to follow Jake because he's telling a fantastic story, and you know, I'm trying to follow that. But I just want to say that Jake is a volunteer. Jake chose to use the Cool Farm tool 3 years ago as part of his assessment for his LEAF, Linking Environment and Farming assessment. It was great to be able to build on those assessments in recent weeks and build them up and tell the full story. So that's just what I'm going to do now. I'm going to show you the assessment that Jake's supplied the data for. And I'd like to thank Jake for his time and data. And I'd also like to thank landowner at Overbury Enterprises, which is Penelope Bossum, because Jake and Penelope between them have not only made incredible changes, but you know they've enabled this to be truly durable and sustainable, where a landowner and a farm manager and a team of agricultural experts have actually made this happen. So look, let's just go to the Cool Farm tool. This is what any of you can see if you sign up for a free have a go with Cool Farm tool. You can get a login and you can create an assessment for pretty much any crop or beef or dairy or biodiversity. I've actually prepared some assessments earlier just to save time. This assessment is for one field in Jake's farm for one crop season, growing winter wheat. And we've assessed the inputs and the outputs and just the greenhouse gas, but not the water or the biodiversity or the food loss and waste, which we could have done. For the purpose of today's presentation, we're just looking at this one field of wheat for greenhouse gases. So Jake and I have put this together, and across the tabs of the input zone of the Cool Farm tool, we've entered all the data about the yield, all the data about the crop residue, the soil details about the type of soil, the pH, the inputs of the fertilizers and the energy, the irrigation. In this case, there isn't any, it's a rain-fed field, and also the carbon implications of land use change and any change of practices of regenerative practices. So just very quickly, Jake has achieved quite a respectable 7.2 tons of wheat back in 2005 in this field that we've called Aston. Most fields in the UK have names, and that's rather cute and quintessentially English. But the main point is that in achieving this yield of 7 tons of bread, 2 tons of high protein bread wheat, he's consumed diesel, he's consumed fertilizers, and he's produced a lot of food, but also a lot of crop residue. And when we model all that data in the Cool Farm tool, the Cool Farm tool estimates the emissions that we see from those various sources, which you can see real time online down the side. And if I just convert that to per ton, we can recalculate that. About 300 kilos of CO2 equivalent per ton of wheat from that field, taking account of all the inputs and all the activities that have taken place. Okay, so I mean, very early on in Jake's career at Overbury, he worked on the economic and yield improvement. So I've actually prepared another assessment where we're actually going to look at that, where around about 2010, Jake had got the yield up to somewhere around 8.7 tons per hectare. So this is quite an amazing achievement, 21% improvement in the amount of food which is grown. Same field, changing the inputs a little bit. Jake had to add more fertilizer, so that whereas previously he was just using ammonium sulfate nitrate, monoammonium phosphate, he's now had to add some extra nitrogen in the form of urea to make sure he gets the protein in that higher yield. He's also still, if we look in the fuel and energy tab, he's still ploughing that field, and he's still cultivating, harrowing that field. And in particular, we can see that the plough he's using quite a high amount of diesel fuel to actually manipulate that soil, to lift it, to invert it. And the cultivator, he's making 2 passes, using a lot of diesel again, even more diesel, to break that soil down into a seed bed, which he can then drill the wheat into. However, having made an increase in his yield and having to increase his nitrogen, he still managed to bring down the emissions per ton of that wheat from 307, as you remember it was before, down to 295. And, you know, that's quite respectable. It's a small but significant improvement. And that's generally what we call sustainable intensification. And the bonus on the top of that increase in yield is Jake was able to take half a hectare of this field out of production and dedicate it to a buffer strip at the side of the field, which is providing biodiversity services. It's filtering water, and it's providing you know, a habitat and a sequestration zone. So, you know, very good. Profits are up, production's up. So far, so good, but not enough. Jake wanted to go further, and he took his regenerative agriculture techniques. And I'm just going to show you how those work now, because he talked about introducing cover crops. So if I go to the next assessment I have, which is one where he started to increase the cover, introduce the cover with regenerative agriculture. I've copied that assessment you've just seen, and I've started to introduce new techniques. So here we go. We're starting now with that 295 kilos of CO2 equivalent. So Jake introduces cover crops. In the carbon tab here, we can put in the details of the cover crops that he's started growing, tick the box. We can input that he's gone from no cover crop to cover crop. He did that in 2013, which is 7 years ago, on 100% of the field. And then we recalculate the cover crop benefit there. And we see that in addition to the residue and the soil fertilizer, crop protection and energy, we now have a new bar which enters into the footprint, and it's a negative bar. And it's a negative bar because those 5 tons of dry matter of biomass that Jake had created per hectare are now being put back into the soil. They're not being harvested, they're not being taken away. They're going back into the soil. They're being sequestrated. Their CO2, their carbon that's included in the biomass is going into the soil, nowhere else. And he's getting a big credit there. On this field of 14 hectares, he's getting 7,000 kilos of CO2 credit. So if we actually go and look at what that does to the per ton emissions, we've come down from 295 to 236. That is a massive difference compared to just improving the yield and optimizing the outputs from a fixed area. Those cover crops are providing a huge amount of sequestration. He then went further and said, yeah, let's go into no tillage. So working with Penelope, enabling the investment in the cross slot drill around about 2014, following some trials, he was able to switch to no-till. And here we are, Cool Farm. Cool Farm tool allows us to model that change in tillage practice. We have a tick box here. Have you changed your tillage practices in this field in the last 20 years? Yes, we have. We changed it in 2014-15, say 6 years ago, to 100% of the field. Let's recalculate that one again and have a look at what that does now. On top of the, I'm just going to go back to the crop field just to pick up that calculation. I'm sorry, I haven't saved it. I need to go back and do that again. Tillage change 6 years ago, 100% of the field. Saving
Richard, just on tillage change, click on the drop down.
I'm not the only one either. Going from conventional tillage to no tillage. Yeah. I'm still not getting that calculation through. We've just been having a little bit of trouble today. It may be my mistake. I'm sorry, under pressure. Yeah. Here we go. Look, the sequestration now from the cover crops and the no-till has increased to 15 tons of CO2 equivalent on that field. And that's because not only are the cover crops going into that field, but now having reduced the tillage, we're not inverting the soil. We're not exposing the soil to sunlight, wind, rain, and letting as much organic matter degrade and be released to the atmosphere. So it's protecting the organic matter that's already in there, but it's also protecting that new organic matter from the cover crop that we're pumping in there now every 2 or 3 years at 5 tons per hectare. So we start to see a credit that's building up now. And if we go to look at the per ton impact, we're down from 295 to 238 to 167. So we've now almost halved the footprint. And that's remarkable, really. We've stopped ploughing, we've stopped using the cultivator. Those 2 machines that I showed you using large amounts of diesel, but that also saves Jake the time that he talked about. It saves wear and tear on the machinery, and it also improves the soil in terms of building the structure, in terms of building the biodiversity, which in turn builds the nutrient availability and the ability of the crops to establish and build even higher yields. And then the last one is that very recently Jake started to export some of his straw to a neighbour's farm in return for the neighbour then returning the straw with cattle manure as what we call farmyard manure, straw and manure together. So in the inputs here, in addition to the chemical fertilizers which Jake is using, I'm just going to add now another fertilizer input, which is going to be the farmyard manure. Just bear with me one moment. We're going to put about 15 tons, just 15 tons of additional farmyard manure into this system and see what that does then to the carbon balance. So we got 15 tons per hectare of product. We're going to broadcast it in at the beginning, did we start using organic fertilizers only in the last 20 years? Yes, we did. This is a new practice, so it's a boost to the organic matter. We're starting to pump up more organic matter in. How long ago? Well, just 1 year ago, 100% of the field. I'm just going to have to run the save and continue again, and then hopefully we shall see the benefit of the farmyard manure coming in there. Now look, we've gone from 7 tons credit for the cover crops to 16 with the no-till. Now that manure is getting us up to 24 tons of CO2 equivalent for that 14 hectares. And that's because of not just the organic matter that comes in with it, but the biology that supports and the improvement to the efficiency of capturing and retaining carbon. Now look at the ton, down from 307 down to 133. So, you know, this is where we are now. This is Jake's story so far. But Jake's completed his first decade of action and is well through his second decade of action. And I know he's not going to stop where he is now. He's going to keep going. And so there's more opportunity there. A couple of thoughts in observing the data here. Jake's using some urea to top up the nitrogen for the end of the crop cycle. Urea is quite high emissions. It tends to be quite lossy, but it's cheap and easy to apply. So maybe an alternative to urea could be considered to help to reduce the significant burden of the soil and fertilizers emission. But Jake's also capturing in these cover crops a lot of legumes, a lot of nitrogen from legumes. So for example, he's got vetch in there, which is capturing maybe 30, even 40 kilos of nitrogen through the winter season every couple of years. His farmyard manure, 15 tons of farmyard manure, theoretically brings in 90 units of nitrogen per hectare. Now, I say theoretically because that nitrogen is slow release. It doesn't all become available like chemical nitrogen in the first few days or weeks after application. It may take months or even years to become progressively available. But there is certainly an opportunity for trialing reducing the chemical nitrogen to reduce the size of this bar. And I would honestly say that there is a strong chance that Jake, with his attitude, his can-do attitude, and his determination to always look for good, better, best solutions, will actually be able to drive down not only from 307 to 133, but actually to net zero and into net sequestration in the longer term. I'm just going to show you one other feature of the Cool Farm tool before I move on the results tab, which is where I can actually see not only the emissions for this model, which is after we've gotten up the yield, after we've done the cover and the tillage and the manure, but actually we can make a comparison between what we got at the end from that scenario, but I can go back to look at what was the baseline that I started off here back in 2005, and I can compare the two. And this is a neat little feature of the Cool Farm tool, that it will show me what it was like before, what it was like after. And the big one we can see here is this credit for the cover crops, the manures, and the low tillage. Those regenerative agriculture techniques that we know can turn agriculture from a perceived problem into a real solution. And if that was rolled out across the globe, we could see some massive sequestration from atmospheric carbon. I just want to go to share now just a couple of slides at the very end of my session, just to remind you that what we've seen, and that is that those 5 models, that's the cascade that we've gone through. Jake has achieved from 2005 to 2019 in terms of his emissions from growing wheat in that field. But final slide is to say, so how does that look then in terms of the carbon balance? What's the overall effect over the 14 years? Now, forgive my wordy slides, but let's just run through that line by line. The organic matter inputs, on average, about 7 tons of crop residue per year, about 2 tons from cover, because Jake's growing cover crops not every year, perhaps every 2 or 3 years. And that 15 tons of manure per hectare, well, when we dry it out, look at dry matter content, that's probably around about 1 ton. So about 10 tons of organic matter, dry organic matter, is going into each hectare of that field every year. So if we accumulate that over the 14 years that we've studied it here, yeah, we've perhaps put a little bit more in later and a little bit less in earlier, but we estimate about 100 to 140 tons in total of dry organic matter have gone into that field. Now, Jake, of course, being a professional farmer, he relies a lot on soil tests and tissue tests because it's a very scientific process to manage the inputs and the outputs. And his soil tests, his laboratory soil tests from 2005 to 2019, show he's increased soil organic matter from 1.1% to 2.9%. And that, when you measure it, when you calculate that, the math says that that is 70 tons of organic matter for every hectare in that field, which is an incredible amount to have increased. It's about 5 tons of organic matter, dry organic matter per year. Now, when we model it in the Cool Farm tool, we get about a 0.8 ton per year, or 1,700 kilos of CO2 per hectare per year. Going back to that 24,000, that purple bar that we saw, we calculate that through to organic matter, we get about 0.8. Well, so that says the Cool Farm tool is actually a very conservative model. And most, but not all of that gap is explained by the fact that in being conservative, the Cool Farm tool does not give credit for the crop residue going back into the soil. So it's very conservative. So if you were to use Cool Farm tool to model your carbon sequestration, you're being very conservative, you're being very safe side. So if anybody, you know, is thinking, how can it possibly be that through Cool Farm tool, we can be capturing 1,700 kilos of CO2 per hectare per year? Well, actually, that is lower bound, that is low side. It's absolutely possible. And those of you who were on the call yesterday heard Helen and John Hillier from Edinburgh University talking about the fact that through carbon inputs like cover crops, we can quite easily see up to 3,000 kilos of CO2 equivalent per hectare going into the soil. Okay, so I'm going to close now and say, look, this is not the end of the story. Today is not the last time that you will see or hear from Jake, because, you know, he's a Cool Farm volunteer for many years, and he has kindly offered to help us tell the real story as to what goes on in the ground alongside the carbon, and showing that overlap between financial, environmental, and carbon. In some of Jake's other fields, I have seen his soil tests where he has taken some of those fields on heavier soil up to 8.8%. Yes, I said 8.8% of organic matter. And this is incredible. That's 300 tons of organic matter per hectare. So there is no doubt that regenerative agriculture techniques work. Jake's talked about them today. He's, you know, in his second decade of action. Many other farmers are also trying, but a lot still aren't. And I think that's where Cool Farm Alliance and its members come in to say, can we help and encourage more and more hectares, more and more farmers across the globe adopt these techniques, which actually transfer fairly easily with a bit of thought and a bit of tweaking. If you read published information such as the Drawdown Project and the Drawdown recent report, you can just see how huge these potential solutions from agriculture could actually be. So well done, Jake, in your second decade of action. A challenge to everybody out there and all the farmers and food chains who perhaps can get more people into their first and into their second decade too. I'll pause now for a few questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard. It's amazing to have you walk through all that in detail. We actually need to make up a little bit of time, so keep the questions coming and keep voting. We're going to move on and try to take the questions at the end, so to try to make up a little bit of time. Wonderful to see that large scale work, soil, real soil stewardship. We're going to move to another part of the globe now and have Monika Firl talk to us about some of the work that CoopCoffees is doing to really acknowledge and honor the best of the coffee farming that they're finding in their supply chain.
Hello, everyone. Can we move to the next slide? So thanks again. Good morning. Thanks again for this opportunity to share a little bit about what we're doing here at CoopCoffees. We are a roaster-owned importing cooperative comprised of 23 roaster businesses across Canada and the US. And I could talk a lot about our history, but really what I want to underscore for this conversation is the importance of long-term and sustainable relationships for us. This is really one of our core values, but it's also been a primary driver of our success as a business and really one of our greatest assets. So I would say instead of shying away from it, we celebrate the mutual dependency between roasters and coffee producers. And this has played in a lot to the support work we do with farmers and, as we'll see, our interest with the Cool Farm Tool. So next slide, please. So since we do import direct, we've been hearing a lot about climate change for many, many years before this became considered a crisis in the world of coffee and agriculture. But it was in 2013 where we and the rest of the industry really got this serious wake-up call. And this is when La Roya, or coffee leaf rust, hit Latin America really hard. So unfortunately, much of industry advice and investment was really focusing on how to save the harvest and export levels rather than how to restore balance in farmers' fields. And we also initially reacted to this situation and really punctual support to confront the disease. But then we quickly learned that we were actually dealing with something that was much, much bigger, and that is climate change and very tired soils. We're looking here, we're at Oscar Alonso. He's a small scale organic coffee farmer from Marcala, Honduras. And he's showing me his neighbor's fields here. And like much of the region, it was absolutely devastated by this leaf rust. And behind him is his field, which was essentially left untouched by this fungus. And he was getting some of the most incredible yields I had ever seen in coffee. And it was such a shocking, visible contrast. I felt I just needed, see if you can see the turn on camera. Oh, sorry. Okay, here I am. So this was such a visible contrast between what we're seeing across the entire region. And essentially that is where I learned the incredible power of living soils and the resiliency of natural systems if we can create a situation where those systems can thrive. And so this was also key in understanding this important role of beneficial microbiology brought back into soils. So at the same time, this really redirected much of CoopCoffees' producer support, and it launched our Carbon, Climate, and Coffee Initiative. So next slide. So essentially what we're trying to do is, as roasters and an importer, we do have emissions that we can't reduce. So as our emissions are going up, we want to take responsibility for that. And so for many years now, we've been charging what we're calling a voluntary carbon tax to our roasters. That money, 3 cents a pound, is going into a fund that we've been using to support producers to learn about some of these practices, to initiate some reforestation, some soil improvement, improved composting, different practices. As Jake was talking about, many of the things, very different, coffee from grains, but many of the soil practices are very, very similar. So you're trying to give our farmers the opportunity to both improve the soils and their production and their resiliency, but also for us to assume responsibility for some of the emissions that we are unable to reduce in our business. So on to the next slide. And a lot of that, what we've done is really harness the power, the ingenuity, the intelligence of some of our best producer partners. And COMSA here in Honduras has been really a cornerstone of sharing their knowledge. We've done a lot of farmer-to-farmer exchanges with them to bring other farmers to see what's possible in their fields when they're using best organic practices and understanding these natural, the natural balance that they need to achieve with better soil management. So next slide. And big motivator, because this is what regenerative organic coffee production can look like. This is another field, a different field from one of the COMSA farmers, and fields like this. So in the process, we've seen a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of energy, a lot of replication, a lot of follow-up by our farmer partners themselves to bring more people in and deepen their understanding, to take courses, really looking at how to bring all these elements together. And so this has been really great for us, but it's also been kind of this in-house approach, and it was going to be very difficult for us to scale, and therefore very difficult for us to have the impact that we wanted in the face of this larger climate change challenge. So next slide. And so it's in the midst of kind of thinking about this when we met our friends from Sustainable Food Lab and the Cool Farm tool. And what we discovered there was a tool that was very user-friendly. One of the first tools I had come across that was bringing soil carbon into account, and that also has legitimacy in front of industry leaders. So we really saw this as a way to help us tell this story, both internally within CoopCoffees, but also CoopCoffees out to the rest of the industry. Because at the end of the day, what we really want is to see this type of support, this type of relationship along the supply chain to replicate, and to grow. So next slide. And so we are currently launching a project that's going to be supporting some of the enhancements to the perennial module. And we will be implementing pilot applications of the Cool Farm tool with 6 of our producer partners in 3 different countries. And what we hope is to be able to provide an example that others can join, they can replicate, they can expand upon, they can improve upon. And I've been hearing really, really enthusiastic feedback from industry leaders. So that's also, it's between just a change in context within specialty coffee, also with facing these realities of climate change on our sector. There's been many, many research studies now showing the dire impact that climate change will have on coffee growing regions. It's expected if things don't turn around within decades, more than half of current coffee regions will no longer be viable for coffee production. So there's a lot of motivation. And so this is what we want. We want to be able to apply a tool that's demonstrating, it's illustrating to farmers this impact of that can bring balance, life, and carbon sequestration to their fields. And then next slide, please. And ultimately, what we want is also to be able to use validated information in order to begin offering financial premiums to our partners for the hard work that they're doing in order to capture the carbon and to manage these natural resources. And in addition to growing the excellent coffee that they offer us, they're also doing a service to us and to the planet, and we think that they deserve to be compensated financially for that. So this is a tool that's helping us to be able to put some numbers on that, and then really facilitate roasters to be able to invest in this type of work to balance out their own carbon footprints, and to be also spokespersons to the coffee industry and out to a larger consuming population, so that we can use coffee as a climate solution. And at the same time, we are really supporting our supply chain to good for our business because we're getting the reliable supply. And of course, it's great for our farmer partners who we hold very near and dear. So that's kind of the nutshell. I don't know if I rushed through this too much, but so we have huge expectations for Cool Farm Tool. We see the farmers, we've introduced this already in 2 different regional workshops. The farmer, our partners, are super enthusiastic. They see this as something that's not just going to be putting a score on their fields, but it's also a great, as we saw in the live demo, just to show how some changes in different practices can really make a difference in the health of soil, in the carbon accumulation, and so all of that is also turning into a great, potentially a great training tool for promoters to explain to farmer members within their co-ops where their low-hanging fruit is and how can they most quickly improve the overall sort of health and balance of their fields. So I think I'll leave it there. And again, thanks for this opportunity.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Monika. It's very exciting working with you on this. And so appreciate your initiative and leadership.
Super. Well, thanks to you. Okay.
We are going to turn now to, again, to the sort of opposite, maybe in terms of scale. So over to Nestlé and hear from Urs about their use of the Cool Farm Tool on their fresh milk supply. Thank you, Urs.
Hello, everyone. This is Urs Schenker. I work at the Nestlé Research Center, and I'm going to share the experience that we've had with rolling out the Cool Farm Tool for our fresh milk sourcing. Next slide, please. We have made a pledge recently, last September, in fact, that we want to align our company behind the Paris Agreement, meaning that we want to limit our contribution to climate change to 1.5 degrees. And that means to become a climate neutral company by 2050. And to do that, we obviously have to tackle not just the emissions that occur in our farms, but really the emissions that occur throughout our supply chain, including with our farmers. And dairy is actually a very important contribution. On the next slide, we can see that the ingredients contribute to more than half of the total emissions of Nestlé, and dairy is more than half of this ingredient part there on the very left. So by tackling the fresh milk supply, which is a big part of the dairy supply, we can make we can get a very good understanding of what our greenhouse gas emissions are, and we can prepare our reduction measures so that we contribute to that effort of achieving climate neutrality by 2050. On the next slide, we can see some of the challenges that we've had. Nestlé is sourcing fresh milk from more than 200,000 farmers or farm cooperatives worldwide, basically on most continents except Oceania. It's more than 25 countries, and these are industrialized countries as well as evolving economies. And consequently, also the dairy systems vary very, very widely. We have very large farms, far more than 1,000 cows per farm, to very, very small farms or operations that are not really farms, actually, with just 1 or 2 cows. And this includes grazing systems as well as confined systems. And it also has a variety of different manure management systems. And the Cool Farm tool really offered us a solution, a simple solution, a user-friendly solution to get an understanding of the different dairy operations in the different countries, to understand the baseline that we have, and to continue calculating scenarios and reduction opportunities to reduce or to improve the GHG performance of our farms. On the next slide, we can see how we've the approach that we have taken. So we rolled out the Cool Farm tool in 2 waves over the past half a year or a year to all the dairy fresh milk markets, and actually not directly to our farmers, but to the market agronomists, which are Nestlé employees that are in regular contact with those farmers to help them work on quality issues, yield issues, obviously, and now also on sustainability issues. And if you can just go on with the animation on that slide there. So we've rather than assessing each and every single farm, which would be a huge task with more than 200,000 farms, what we have asked those agronomists to do is to look at their country, to look at grouping their farms into similar archetypes. So we typically recommend, depending on the complexity of a country, to go from 1 to maybe 6 different archetypes in a country, and to group the farms into those archetypes that are similar in terms of the climate or the geography where the farms are operating, the type of feed that is provided to the cattle, the general organizational setup, the size of the farm as well to some extent, and the manure management system. And with that, on the last animation there, with that, actually, instead of doing hundreds of thousands of assessments, we have asked our agronomists to do 1 or maybe a few assessment per archetype, and then we scale the results from those few assessments with the total amount of milk that is bought from that type of farms, and that gives us a footprint information for the archetype, which we can then combine at country and at Nestlé level. On the next slide, we'll just see a couple of results. So the first graph there on top of the slide, this is the split between the different sources of emissions. And I guess it's a bit small to see. So the green one, which is a large contribution, is the feed production. And then the bluish violet color, that's enteric fermentation, which is the other big one, and the manure management is the third one. Not surprisingly, transported energy is relatively small. Grazing is also relatively small because there's not that many grazing systems. That's the upper part, and then on the lower part, we can see a comparison of the impacts from our supply with what data we have used in the past, which is background data. And that gives an indication of how much better our supply chain performs as compared to the country average. And we've seen that this can be quite important. On average, we're somewhere in around the 40% improvement as compared to the background data. And that shows to what extent we have already worked with our farmers, and to what extent this work that we've done in the past has actually already contributed to reducing the greenhouse gas footprint. And you can also see in terms of the absolute numbers that there is some of the best countries are just below 1 kilogram of CO2 equivalent per liter of milk. And then the average is somewhere below 2 kilogram CO2 equivalent per liter of milk. Just on the second but last slide, on the next slide, a discussion or a question on, well, should we actually move towards assessing every single farm? This is something that we have thought of, and in particular for the more mature countries, the industrialized countries where the farms are larger and where also the maturity of the specialists is higher, the expertise is higher. This is something we could be doing, but for the evolving economies, it would be very challenging. And so what we have done instead is reached out to some statisticians that have helped us treat the data as well as possible, taking into account the size of the market, the number of farms, the amount of milk that is sourced, but also the homogeneity of the farms inside an archetype, or how similar the farms are within an archetype, or in other cases, how different they are. And depending on these parameters, the statistical approach can actually calculate a sampling strategy, saying which archetypes it would be best to sample because, for instance, they have a high variability between farms, and also when to stop sampling if you want to achieve a certain level of confidence in your results. And that's quite useful for the future years because we will know how to best achieve the most reliable numbers possible with the least amount of effort. And on the last slide, just as in terms of next steps, in the dairy supply chain, what we are working on right now is to try to put some of the numbers that we need in our assessment into an automated IT exchange platform and API. This would allow us, for instance, to get better quality data automatically supported in the system. For instance, on the amounts that are being purchased, this is obviously available in our purchasing data, or also some quality parameters, quality data, which is already collected by our IT systems, and we can just submit it into the CoolFarm tool without needing it to be coded another time. And we want to repeat the assessment that we have done in 2019 and 2020 from now on every year, and actually confirm that the impact of our interventions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, that those impacts are actually there and that we can follow them with the numbers. And that's for our dairy supply chain. And obviously Nestlé is also a major customer for other important commodities. And we've talked about coffee just before. Cocoa is another one that is really important. And obviously cereals and other row crops are very important as well. We are looking at that as also, we're looking at opportunities that we might have to use an adapted approach of the Cool Farm tool for other ingredients and other supply chains. And we also think that the use of big data, GIS information or satellite data could help us quite a bit on those other secondary materials. And with that, I'm at the end of my presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It's great to see how you're looking at stratifying the different farms into topologies and how you're managing and using some statistical analysis on top, and how the Cool Farm tool is helping you gain visibility and transparency into the types of farms and what the mitigation strategies are and what they could look like. Thank you so much. One of the most exciting developments in the last couple of years in the Cool Farm Alliance community has actually been clusters or working groups clustering around the Cool Farm tool and self-organizing. We're going to hear about two of these coming up, one in the Netherlands and the next one after that in Canada. Yeah, so I think that's maybe an adequate introduction, and I'm pleased to present Peter-Erik, who will tell us a little bit about what brought him to the Cool Farm tool and what they're doing in the Netherlands.
Thank you, Daniela. Can you hear and see me?
Yes, we can. Great, thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I cannot see you all, but I'm now very pleased to present in a few minutes what we're doing in the Netherlands. I used to be working with SciPlatform, as some of you know. I'm now here in my new role in the capacity of Director of Sustainability of Avebe. Avebe is a potato cooperative of 2,300 farmers in the Netherlands and Germany, producing starch and potato protein. By becoming a member, I very much encouraged Avebe to be a member of the Cool Farm Alliance. I thought, well, let's also immediately move and make it effective. So I encouraged a lot of my peers in other Dutch companies to become a member. So you can move to the next slide. And to establish what I've called an arable crops user group of the Cool Farm tool. To kind of assess what the needs and the desires are. We organized on Friday, March the 13th, a meeting, which became a virtual meeting due to Corona. The participants of that meeting were the Dutch branch organization, who is also a member of Cool Farm tool, BO Akkerbouw, and 6 companies, most of them also already being members of the Cool Farm tool, and more or less using the tool in different ways. But there were different levels of user experience present at this meeting, and very much enthusiasm to learn from each other and to use the tool on a larger scale. So the aim of the group that is established now is to improve the usability of the Cool Farm tool for Dutch arable crops and their stakeholders, and to identify opportunities for a wider uptake and other applications here. Next slide, please. What we have seen, and if you bring the tool to practice and a little bit beyond the people who are working, like if you look at Richard, he can dream about the Cool Farm tool, but if you are just an ordinary potato grower in the Netherlands, you're often very much hindered by small translation issues, inconsistency in the translation. That's no criticism, but I think to make that more perfect would largely improve the uptake. And there are a couple of other things that were mentioned during the meeting, which could help the uptake and bring it to really to the field level. I just saw a couple of presentations and I get the impression that not much, and that was also in this meeting, not many real farmers, just normal farmers use the tool. But until now, very much there's a help needed by advisors or experts to use the tool. And my personal opinion, being around in the tool development already for years, was that that many educated farmers, particularly the farmers in the Netherlands or Western Europe or the Western world, should be able to use the tool themselves, because I feel that it provides so much insight to really understand your own business better. So a couple of things that were mentioned in the meeting were the application of carbon farming. We heard a little bit about it yesterday, and from John Hillier as well. To calculate, could there be an improvement for nitrogen inhibitors in the tool? Could there be there was an interest also to create bigger and more important linkages to cost reduction and yield? What is possible and what is already known about that, and the linkage with other farm tools. And there's already a project in the Netherlands working on that with Neo Akkerbouw, the branch organization, to create APIs between existing farm tools, farm management tools, and Cool Farm tool. And I think there's also a very good understanding of the potential of the tool, because there was a warning in this meeting where it said, well, the Cool Farm tool in itself has so much has a better working interface than most of the farm management tools, because, like we saw in Richard's presentation, while you put information into the tool, you get feedback, and that is appreciated a lot. The last point here on this slide is that we in the Netherlands also have a project going on biodiversity. It's a large project for all agriculture, and we particularly start to make a biodiversity monitor, and most of the people who are in the steering group of this project are aware of the Cool Farm tool, and we will definitely look at the Cool Farm tool biodiversity monitor for this as well. And next slide, please, my final slide. So the future of this group is staying together and being actual user group and feedback into the Cool Farm Alliance community. We also need trainers and or train the trainers or whatever skills, and that is something that we need to develop. Exchange experience with farmers. So what I said, farmers, are they really using it themselves, or are it merely consultants or others? And I mentioned about the biodiversity monitor. Can we also connect this to other more governmental developments, like the common agricultural policy in Europe? And what can we do to, what action should we take as Cool Farm Alliance or Dutch community to build that into the systems that create rewards? So there's a lot on the agenda. It's just starting. I'm very pleased to share this with you, and hopefully we can learn from other working groups in the Cool Farm Alliance. So thank you for this opportunity, Daniella and others, and we hope to be a very active member and working group.
Wonderful. No, we're so pleased with the initiative that you're taking to self-organize and consolidate needs and requests and suggestions, and really look to, as you said, not just use the tool, but make sure that it is effective and effective together. That's really exciting.
Thank you.
Over to another part of the world now. So I've asked Karen Haugen-Kozyra from Viresco to tell us what she's been up to in Canada with the Cool Farm tool.
Thank you, Daniella, and hello, everybody. Greetings from Alberta, Canada, where it's -22 this morning when I got up on April 2nd. So our area of the world has a very narrow growing season. Listening to Jake, I was very jealous about the cover crops, and we're just starting to experiment with cover crops here in Canada, and polycropping, intercropping, but our narrow growing season makes it difficult. So we're looking forward to how we can implement some of that and use the Cool Farm tool. So what we're going to do today is talk to you about the Canadian perspective on adapting the Cool Farm tool to broaden it out in terms of scope, which Daniela, in your first slide about scope, support, and enabling change. I'm hoping that we're going to be able to advance the needle on all of those and expanding opportunities for different production systems that we have here in Canada and North America. And presenting with me today is Tom Ogarenko and John Alcock from Trust Bix. Tom is from Trust Bix and John is from Viresco Solutions. The focus here will be on beef. And maybe if I could ask John and Tom to turn their cameras on and take over when I hand it off to you. Why beef? Well, because of the competencies that Trust Bix has shown in tracking the chain of custody of certified sustainable beef in the Canadian beef production system through the supply chain right to the burgers in McDonald's and other beef servings in restaurants, and returning a premium through a blockchain type of online platform back to the producers. So we're very much interested in how do we embed the Cool Farm tool and make sure we expand the scope and the availability and applicability of the tool with beef first, but we're also talking about other verticals. So we want to do that in crops as well. And part of the funding for what we're doing is coming from the Canadian Agri-Food Automation and Intelligence Network. So as we go through the presentation, you'll hear that the stakeholders in the working group are very much focused on digital capture of data and analyticals that are digital based. And so with that, I'll just jump in. If you could advance the slide, Michaela. So I think I kind of went over the vision. The CANE network is very much about scaling, being able to, our little corner of that world, the sustainability metrics that will be generated through the back engine of the Cool Farm tool, really, and to build out more of those incentive programs according to new types of verticals in supply chains. So if you could do the next slide, please, Michaela. The objectives of the working group in terms of being able to do that, expand the scope and do the enabling and provide more support is basically these 4 objectives. It's going to be ambitious and I think the Cool Farm tool can really help us with some of those solutions and comparing scenarios in order to, calculate the deltas of certain of the metrics that we want to see and experiment with that with the growers and the producers in our working group in the supply chain. Next slide, please. If you could just click through the animation, Michaela. I'm sorry about the animation, but what we had in June is, next one, thank you, back. As we sat back and admired about 1.5 years ago, what do we have here in Canada in terms of assets, drivers and enablers, and the outcomes we want to achieve? We do have a number of engaged farm groups at the producer level, as well as along the supply chain with commitments that they've made, some of the major brands. The Cool Farm tool and the Bix platform, a lot of uptake in data-driven farm management systems, and the Certified Sustainable Beef Program, which enables us to build on the competency and platform of Bix. And so we're working on beef first, and we're about 1.5 years into that. John Alcock, I know, has been pestering a lot of you, Jan, Peter, John, Claire, Intran and Sarah, trying to move the needle around the beef module, and we're doing, I think, a really great job and identifying improvements for everybody. We're going to be moving on to crops next, but the idea is be able to track and report on the sustainability metrics that are associated with the products that are coming through the supply chain. Next slide, please. So who are the partners in CANE? Well, besides Trust Bix and Viresco, we're working with the colleges. They are going to be the test beds for the smart farms and the alpha testing of the interoperability of these devices that we want to be putting on farm. We've got McDonald Detweiler and Linamar, who are in, to building the Canada Arm, robotics, remote sensing, those sorts of things to bring to the table. And there's 52 other network members. In terms of our data platform for sustainability, We have a number of engaged and interested parties that are going to be working with us as we move forward in building out the verticals and testing and modifying and increasing the applicability of the Cool Farm tool through the supply chain. Next slide, please. And so, John, over to you, and going through the emerging sustainability framework in terms of what what we envision.
Okay, Michaela, could you just click through the animations again? I apologize. I just caught those last night when it was too late. Just a couple more, I think. Yeah, one more. Perfect. So, so this is kind of demonstrating what Daniela talked about a little bit earlier today about incentivizing farmers for their carbon sequestration or emission reductions. And some of you will probably be familiar with this type of sort of framework or system that we're seeing sort of emerging as more and more companies begin to set ambitious greenhouse gas emissions targets and start to look to their supply chains to achieve those targets. So we'll start at the top of this diagram with the international sustainability targets. So those are initiatives such as the Science Based Targets Initiative. And large agri-food brands and retailers, I mean, we had a good demonstration just then from yours at Nestlé in terms of them sort of setting those targets. And they're being driven to set those targets by investors or consumer demand or media. There's several different sort of pressures for people to set those targets. And those large agri-food brands and retailers are now looking to those supply chains to help them meet those targets. And this is where we see some good potential to use the Cool Farm tool in two ways, I think. First of all, to sort of model or kind of seek out hotspots within the supply chain to for the large agri-food brands and retailers to invest in to achieve emission reductions, and also to then kind of work the other way and sort of provide some credibility to those supply chain emission reductions that they can then take back to those sustainability target setting in organizations to make sort of credible claims against those targets that they've set. So yeah, you can see on the side there at the bottom, I've got some kind of examples. They're beef-centric examples, but how we think the Cool Farm tool can help identify changes to herd management or different types of equipment or feed management to achieve those emission reductions through the supply chain, which can then be claimed by those large brands and retailers. Next slide, please. And I will hand over to Tom here. Again, there's a few animations on here. So Michaela, if you wouldn't mind just clicking through, there's a couple more. Perfect. Okay, over to you, Tom.
Thanks, Karen and John. Thank you for including the conversation.
Really sadly, Tom, the audio is not coming through. It's all garbled. I'm wondering if it doesn't cure itself, if John or Karen could talk us through it. Do you want to give it one more shot?
Let's give it another try. Is that looking better?
I think we'll have to go to John or Karen. Yeah, sorry about that.
For some reason, your sound system in your command center is not doing too well. So I'll just walk you through this. This schematic here is sort of displaying how we see the whole process working across the supply chain. And this was developed between Craig Simonson and Thesis and Tom working back and forth with their software analytical minds. And so basically the farm management software that Danielle had mentioned, being able to have digital upload through APIs into the SAFT platform. There's going to be a lot of other devices that'll be tested on the smart farms at the colleges as part of the alpha testing procedure and the load up. There's also going to be, I mean, you can't get around some spreadsheet data from farms that you collect, right? In terms of what their management practices and activities are. And then having this Cool Farm tool as the back engine calculation like the side platform does, and being able then to import those numbers. And we're also thinking of also the field to market, field print calculator as well, as we'll get into the second year of this 5-year program. And then being able to have that platform crunch the numbers, produce dashboards that the producers can access, right? Which is a lot of the functionality. The Cool Farm tool right now will be sort of mimicking it and looking at benchmarking and where they look at their performance, run different scenarios like Richard presented, and then ultimately being able to track through the assessments and the share codes of the Cool Farm tool, the aggregated data that would be that some of the retailers and brands who are participating in the pilots that will be the incentive programs for those sustainability metrics. So we see a series of pilots on those verticals that I mentioned with Be First, then crop, and that sort of as we move forward in different verticals. Next slide, please, Michaela. And then this is sort of the platform concept within the CANE initiative called the Sustainable Agri-Food Tracking Program. We see the outcomes along the top line, the verticals throughout the whole supply chain, which, you know, demonstrating the competency that we've done with certified sustainable beef and the partners with McDonald's and Cargill on the processing side, and the retailers. Then the creating the verifiable claims and you know, being able to track those attributes. Definitely crops are going to be a big challenge, but we know others have done it in the Cool Farm Alliance environment. So we'd be interested in learning more from them, of, you know, the Mars pilot and some of the Syngenta pilots and how they're tracking those things. And then have that base competency of the TrustBix blockchain traceability solution, and looking at sort of the third-party validation, and then underpinned by the bottom line, which is really the colleges, the extension to producers, building the literacy and the competency within the grower community and the producer community, the traceability in the middle, working with the connectors, if you will. We certainly got that at our workshop last June, that the people who manage the data for farmers and growers and producers, the people in the middle are going to be absolutely essential in this in order to build that competency along the supply chain, and then the strong global brands that are supporting us through this process. So that's about it. I hope I made time.
Wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, so really exciting to see a traceability program already in place that is now being extended into also being able to include and account for and maybe compensate for sustainability credentials and at scale in terms of the industry at large in Canada. Amazing. Okay, our final member presenter, as you've heard, the Cool Farm Alliance, our objective is to really facilitate the change. One of our members has been chasing that particular tail and built the Cool Farm tool into their offering, and is going to tell us a little bit about how that all works. So over to you, Andrew. Thank you for presenting.
Pleasure. Thank you, everyone. And Daniela, can you just confirm that you can see and hear me and my screen?
All good.
Perfect. Thank you. So I'm not actually going to do a presentation today. I'm going to do a demonstration of the farm diagnostic tool that we at Soil Capital have developed. And in a nutshell, how this works is we interact with a farmer once to collect their operational data, and we give back to that farmer two things. One is an analysis of their financial performance. The second is an analysis of their greenhouse gas profile. And we're able to link the two and benchmark that farmer against regional peers. And before I launch into that demonstration, I want to tell you why we've gone to the effort to build this tool. For those of you that don't know, Soil Capital is a team of independent agronomists and finance professionals. And our mission is to enable farmers to commit 1 million hectares of farmland to more profitable regenerative agriculture by 2025. Now, the good news is that in our experience, the journey to that regenerative destination, of course, does achieve net carbon neutrality, and it can even achieve, it can result in farmers becoming a net sink. That's the good news. But the more challenging news that we've experienced through our work across 20 countries in 5 continents is that if you approach farmers simply on the basis of wanting to help them and understand and optimize their environmental impacts, it can be really, really hard to persuade large numbers of farmers to dedicate time to sharing their data, and more importantly, to acting on the findings. And it might be that some of you who work for brands have seen something similar in your own supply chain programs as you've tried to move from pilot projects where already engaged farmers have contributed and move that impact to scale. Maybe you've experienced something similar. So for us, what we've observed and learned is that there is no better way to motivate and engage a farmer than to help him or her understand the connectivity between their financial performance and their environmental performance, and specifically focusing on their production costs, since that's what they can control the most. So what I'm going to show you here are dummy results, but they're or dummy data, but it's absolutely derived from real data that we have been collecting and analyzing in the field. And as you'll already have seen, this is in French because the tool is currently deployed in France and French-speaking Belgium, but I will translate as we go. So we have a couple of pages that introduce how the methodology in the tool works. And then the first real slide with data is this one here. And what we do to start with is we reflect back to the farmer that, of course, this farmer in this question is farming across 125 hectares. And this is the composition, of their rotation. You can see here the wheat crop, the oilseed rape, and between those two crops alone, you can see they're contributing to 75% of this particular rotation. And we'll come back to wheat a lot during this story since it's such a dominant part of this particular rotation. What we then do is show who we are comparing this farmer to. In this case, 22 other farms, nearly 3,000 hectares. We show the farmer the soil types that his or her peer farmers are farming, and we show them where this benchmark is located, in this case, in northern France and southern Belgium, all of which results in the farmer understanding whether they believe they can trust the benchmark because they are comparable peers or not. Bottom left here, we have some commentary on yields, but I'm going to dip into that in a little more detail in the next slide. So now we start diving into the analysis itself, starting with the economics. And what we have here are the production costs organized around each crop in the rotation, showing the costs per hectare and the costs per ton. And on each of these charts, and indeed throughout the report, you see in blue the farmer's own costs, in yellow the average in the benchmark, and in brown the costs achieved by the 25% top performers with the lowest costs. And if we just drill down into wheat and focus our eye on the wheat chart here, you can see that in this particular case, this crop that is driving so much of the rotation in this particular farm, the farmer is spending, well, double what the top performers in his or her benchmark are spending. And so immediately we can see there's something to dig into around this important crop in the rotation. What our system then does on the top right here is do a calculation of the potential cost savings that this farmer could achieve if he adopted the practices of the top quartile, those with the lowest costs of production, and applied them across his entire rotation. And that's obviously a pretty significant number. We'll treat it with a note of caution. But what we can do is drill down into the wheat and identify that actually that wheat is contributing close to 50% to that overall potential cost savings. The final bit of this slide is perhaps the most important, because at this point, what the farmer may say is, well, what if those neighbors are saving money on their production costs, but also sacrificing yield? Well, here we're showing the yield of the farmer for wheat and the yield of that top quartile with the lowest production costs, which exceeds their yield. So immediately that question is addressed, that these farmers are not sacrificing yield, and it prompts the farmer to want to know more. Here we start drilling down into what is driving those production costs. And if we zoom in on wheat, we can look at this for the mechanical operations, the fertilization costs, the agrochemical costs, and the seed costs. And here what we see when we compare the farm's costs with the top quartile is that there's an overspend on mechanization. So perhaps you could start to conclude that this farmer is over-mechanized. And there is an overspend compared to the top quartile on fertilizer inputs and agrochemicals, probably driven both by a volume effect, the farmer being cautious and applying more volume than his peers, perhaps also by a pricing effect where he's not being as diligent as he might be to get the best deal. Now, we don't have time to go into this detail on this call, but what we then do is go further into these production indicators, looking, for example, at the time spent on mechanized operations, the fuel consumption, and also the application of fertilizers per hectare and per ton, and the overall horsepower used. These are all metrics that you heard Jake right at the top of the webinar referring to. And in this particular farmer's case, it leads to the conclusion that over-mechanization and over-application of inputs is something that he could be addressing. And with the confidence that the top quartile of farmers in his benchmark is not sacrificing yield by having a lighter intensity of mechanization and lower inputs. So at this point in the report, what we find in our experience is that the farmer is really well primed, first to go off and talk to his or her advisor or agronomist and ask, how can I achieve the performance of the top performers? But also, therefore, to understand how the environmental impacts of their practices relate to the conclusions that we've already been able to draw. So then we move on to the greenhouse gas profile, and we loudly and proudly remind the farmer that the Cool Farm tool is, of course, the engine behind these calculations. And what we see here on the top left is the average emissions per hectare that is derived from the Cool Farm tool calculations at the whole farm level. So you can see in this particular case that the farmer is a net emitter, but in the benchmark, the top 25% of performers are actually already net sequestering carbon. Now, this is just looking at all of the rotations in that particular benchmark. What we know, of course, is that the choice of crops in a rotation does have a big impact on the overall emissions. So what we do in this chart here is to show what would be the case if all of the other farmers in the benchmark took the practices that they're already using, but applied them to our farmers' rotation. And reassuringly, the same story comes out. There is significant room for improvement. Comparing just to the existing practice in the benchmark, the farmer could become a net sink of carbon. We're then able, with the help of the Cool Farm tool, to drill down into what is driving this greenhouse gas profile. And above the zero line here, you have everything that's contributing to emissions by crop. And below the zero line, you have everything that's contributing to the sinks. And the yellow line is the net position overall. So again, if we zoom in and focus on our wheat, what we see here is that the fertilization emissions, both the application of them and the production of them, are very significant contributors to the overall emissions. And the fact that this farmer is perhaps being too intensive in his land preparation means that there is relatively little sequestration happening underneath the x-axis. And that validates or aligns with some of the conclusions that we reached earlier when looking simply to optimize their financial performance. So to conclude, what we tend to do with the farmers that we work with is to zoom out to the big picture and say, well, look, if you took on this greenhouse gas and financial optimization challenge, just focusing on your wheat, you'd probably tackle about half of your overall footprint. There's clearly more work to do. But perhaps the most powerful conclusion is this chart on the right, which shows on the x-axis, well, it shows overall the relationship between improving your economic performance and influencing your greenhouse gas profile. So you have the higher cost producers on the right here, the lower cost on the left, and the net emitters at the top here and those that are net sinks of carbon here. And you can see quite an interesting relationship emerging just from our existing data collection overall. So that's been a whistle-stop tour, but what I've tried to demonstrate is how we are very consciously bringing together analysis of financial performance and greenhouse gas performance to really drive engagement from farmers, not just in contributing data to a tool like the Cool Farm tool, but actually to acting on its conclusions. Thanks, Daniela.
Wonderful. Thank you. Over to Richard Prophet, who's going to introduce our next speaker. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I think it's a great example of the sort of integrations that we're able to do through the APIs, and for the Cool Farm tool to be a calculation engine within third-party platforms. Our final speaker, I'm delighted to introduce Dave Hughes from Syngenta, and he's going to provide not an alternative, but a view of the future for agriculture. It's quite tech focused, but he challenges the question about whether we need a revolution within agriculture to help drive the future. So with that, I will hand over to Dave. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. So yeah, my name is Dave Hughes. I've worked in research and development for Syngenta for the last 25 years. This is the last presentation, I believe, of the day. It's a bit different to the ones we've seen before. It's more of a provocation, really, I suppose. I've called it Food Foresight and the Future of Farming. Do we need to revolutionize our food system? It seems to me that quite a few people are calling for a revolution in food and agriculture at the moment. And in doing so, many of them are giving the status quo a bit of a kicking. So for example, take a look at these quotes here. Reckless farming is destroying the planet. Serious farm pollution breaches rise. Industrial farming is driving mass extinction of life on Earth. And the global food system is broken and hides huge externalities that are not taken into account in the price of food. It's pretty serious stuff, isn't it? And this isn't coming from the lunatic fringes of the internet. This is coming from mainstream media sources, all in the last 12 months or so. So the one on the top left is from CNN. These two are from The Guardian. This is from The Independent. And this is an editorial from Nature, no less, the world's most prestigious scientific journal. Now, of course, as society rather bites the hand that feeds it, it's no wonder that this is having an impact on the morale of the farming community. Why is everyone turning against us? Agri-bashing now seems to be a thing, at least in France. This quote here is taken from Le Monde. So, what sort of revolution do we need then? Well, some people are clear about this. This is from Friends of the Earth. Farming for the future, organic and agroecological solutions to feed the world. And when many people are talking about a revolution in agriculture, this is the kind of revolution I feel that many of them are talking about, predicated on the belief that these low-intensity farming systems represent a more environmentally friendly way of producing food. And that seems intuitively obvious, but there's a bit of devil in the detail here, I think. And I'm fundamentally rather nervous about the suggestion that these low-intensity systems should be significantly more widespread. And the heart of my nervousness is around this, that crop yields for these low-intensity systems are generally substantially below conventional crop yields. Now, the organic movement often railed against this in the past, but I think it's pretty much well accepted now. Here's some data to back this up. So this is a big study on USDA data from 2014, when organic and conventional crop yields were compared crop by crop and state by state right across the United States. And the further the green bar goes across to the right-hand side, the bigger the gap between conventional and organic yields. So for example, for cotton at the top here, organic cotton yields are about 45% below conventional crop yields in the same region. So you can see there's quite a significant yield gap for most of these row crops here. Not all of them though. There are some crops where the yield gaps are pretty small. There are some crops where the organic systems are actually more productive, in fact, but that's not generally the case. The yield gap is typically maybe 20 to 40%. And you see a similar pattern with vegetable crops like this. You see a similar pattern with trees, nuts, and vines. So why does this make so much of a difference? Well, consider this hypothetical situation here. This is an island in the middle of the sea, say a remote island. And there are three things on this island. There's a village community, there's a farm, and there's some wild land. Call it a nature reserve, perhaps. Now, the farm is a high-tech, modern, conventional, intensive farm, and it just about produces enough food to satisfy the nutritional needs of the village throughout the year. So the island is self-sufficient in food. But the villagers are concerned about the impact that this intensive cropping system is having on the environment in the island, okay? And they are putting the farmer under pressure to convert to, say, organic farming practices. But what would be the consequence of actually doing that? Well, clearly, if the farmer just converted his land to organic, then clearly there'll be less food produced, 20 to 40% less food. So if that's the only thing that actually happened, then of course that wouldn't produce enough food to feed the village. So the villagers would go hungry. And that, of course, is not a sustainable solution. In order to produce the same amount of food, the farmer would clearly have to farm more land. You know, so if the yield gap was, say, 33%, then the farm would have to be 50% bigger in order to produce the same amount of food. But the only place the farm can expand into is, of course, the nature reserve. And converting wild land into farmland, no matter what type of farmland we're talking about, that is always very bad for the environment, because the environmental metrics will lurch badly in the wrong direction in terms of biodiversity or greenhouse gas emissions. And so, in fact, that is not really a very sustainable option. Converting wild land into organic farmland for the sake of the environment doesn't actually make much sense at all. Okay, then, so what if we revert to plan A, just convert the existing farm to organic and give up on the idea of self-sufficiency and simply import more food in order to make up the shortfall? Okay, well, that's a possibility, but fundamentally, somewhere else in the world, we're going to have to produce more food that we didn't need to produce before, because in the past, the island was self-sufficient. So fundamentally, new farmland will have to be created somewhere in order to make this additional food. So you're ending up fundamentally in the same place. New farmland will have to be created from wildland in order to make up the shortfall. So that's not a great solution either. And perhaps you can see where this argument is actually going. If this, in fact, is not an island in the middle of the sea, but rather a continental landmass on a planet with urban areas, with farmed areas, with wild areas, these same arguments still hold, right? But there is no second planet from which we can import food. So in other words, when you scale up to a planetary scale, that's not an option at all. So the question becomes then, well, what is the best way of producing enough food to feed a population whilst minimizing the impact on the environment? Well, of all the options considered, in fact, the status quo is probably the best, because it maximizes the amount of wildland that's actually retained. But that's not to say that the situation is all fine, of course. For me, I think one of the biggest innovation challenges we face is how can we make intensively farmed land more environmentally friendly without collapsing the yield in the process? Or you could actually frame what I think is exactly the same question in a different way. You could ask, well, how can you take sustainably farmed land and make it more productive without collapsing the environmental metrics at the same time? For me, that's the same question, because the end point is the same in both cases: highly productive, highly sustainable farming systems. My bet is that if we actually manage to achieve that, then those farming systems won't look very much like conventional modern day high-tech farming systems, nor will they look very much like modern day agroecology either. They'll be different. They may have factors in common between the two systems, but they will be distinctly different. But different in what way? Different how? I'll hold that thought for a minute. I'll come back to that. But there's a couple of other things I'd like to show you first. Take a look at this, for example. So this is some work by CSIRO in Australia, where they actually try to predict global food demand looking forward into the future. Now, quite a few groups have had a go at doing this, and they all come to similar conclusions that come the middle of this century, we're going to need to be producing about twice as much food as we were producing at the start of this century, which is quite an intimidating challenge, right? Now, I'll show you this particular example because they also did a second calculation, which I think is interesting. So they actually calculated that if you take the 50 years between 2010 and 2060, then we're going to have to produce more food in that 50-year period than agriculture has ever produced since the dawn of farming, 12,000 years ago. So in other words, this slight light blue area here is larger than this slightly darker blue area here, even if we extrapolate this curve all the way back to 10,000 years BC. So that is actually quite a thought as well, isn't it? Okay, but take a look at this then. So this is United Nations data on global food production expressed as a dollar value at constant exchange rates from 1960 up to the present day, so over the last 60 years or so. And what you can see is that over the past 60 years, we've actually trebled the amount of food that is actually being produced, trebled. So that's really good news, right? All of a sudden, a doubling of productivity over the next 50 years doesn't look quite so intimidating, does it? And also take a look at this as well. This is what's happened to global farmed area over the same period of time. And you can see it's remained pretty much flat. This is cropland in green and pasture land here in blue. So in other words, we've achieved this trebling of productivity by increasing yield per unit area. We haven't increased the area to any significant extent. In actual fact, you can see here just about that global farmland peaked around the turn of the millennium, and it's been declining slightly ever since. So that's good news as well. This final graph on this page here is essentially the same as the one on the left here, only plotted on different scales. So what I've done here is taken the data points from this line here since the turn of the millennium, then I've fitted this straight line to those data points and extrapolated forward to 2050. So the position of the star on this graph here represents a doubling of food production from a baseline of the year 2000. So you can see, just simply by extrapolating the current trend, we're actually due to slightly overshoot that target of doubling food production by 2050. Not by very much. I mean, we can't be complacent here, and there are plenty of factors that could end up leveling this curve out or pulling it down, like climate change, for example. But at the face of it, this is actually quite an optimistic picture, I think. So how has this actually been achieved then? You know, if you teleported back to 1960 and spoke to a farmer then and said that by 2020, it's possible to produce 3 times as much food from the same land, that farmer would struggle to believe how that might be possible. But for us now, looking backwards, the answer's obvious, right? We've got better technologies today than were possible in 1960. We've got better seeds, we've got better chemicals, we've got better machinery, we've got better livestock breeds, we've got better information, we've got better ways of integrating all of those technologies together. Now, as those innovations came online for farmers, I doubt if very many of them felt truly revolutionary at the time. It was much more of a stepwise incremental improvement in the situation. You know, some steps bigger than others, of course, but stepwise nonetheless. But of course, if you take a large enough number of steps over a long enough time period, you can travel a tremendous distance. So imagine going back to this farmer in 1960 and telling that farmer that in 2020, tractors will be driving all by themselves based on signals beamed down to them from space. Or that in 2020, scientists will be able to take DNA from pretty much any organism you like in nature and incorporate that DNA into crop plants in order to improve their properties. Or that in 2020, pretty much everyone will carry in their back pocket a device that will give them instantaneous access to the sum total of human knowledge to enable them to make better decisions. You know, those technologies will be mind-boggling for that farmer because there's nothing familiar, nothing relatable that farmer could use in order to extrapolate forward to get to the futures that I'm describing. So as a result of that, those futures would sound to that farmer just like science fiction, indistinguishable, just like Star Trek technologies like, you know, warp drives or teleportation or that kind of thing. But the thing is, the pace of change is actually accelerating. It's not decelerating today, which means that you can bet your bottom dollar that in 60 years' time, farmers will routinely be using technologies which to us today are indistinguishable from science fiction. And that is how we're actually going to be able to make agriculture more sustainable and more productive at the same time. But what are these technologies going to be? Well, it's impossible to say 60 years out. Of course, too many things are going to happen in that particular time frame. But if you wind that time frame back into maybe 10 to 20 years, it is possible to see things going on in the present which may indicate what the future is actually going to be like. And this is something that I'm interested in here. This is some work that I did myself a couple of years ago. Every blue dot on this diagram here is a technology which has the potential to impact on agriculture in one way or another. This is a different view of the same set of technologies here. It's a very complex, very dynamic picture. I was going to actually go through a couple of the technology trends that are apparent from this kind of work. I was going to try and squeeze 3 in initially, then it became entirely obvious that I could only do 2. And under the circumstances, I'm more or less out of my time now. I think I'll limit myself to just 1 actually. So I'll skip over that slide here and tell you a little bit about pest control in the future as I see it. So I think the future of pest control is very likely to be less chemical and more biological. Chemical pest control, chemical pesticides are extremely unpopular, and we're losing them from the market at an alarming rate, of course, far faster than we can invent new ones. And the general feeling is that biological pest control is going to come riding in on a big white horse and save the day. However, there's a bit of a dirty little secret that isn't actually often spoken about, and that is that most, maybe many pest control, biological pest control methods at the moment are not actually very good, at least when you compare them with the corresponding chemical pest control. So how can we make biological pest control more efficient and more effective? There are a number of ways we're trying to do that, but one in particular I think is quite interesting, based on a new phenomenon called RNA interference. Now, let me try to explain this very briefly. A bit of basic biology is required here, so bear with me just for a moment. All of the interesting dynamic processes of life are done by proteins within our cells. So they do things like catalyze chemical reactions, they respond to changes in the external environment, they're responsible for things like movement within our cells and structure within our cells. It's all to do with proteins, like little molecular machines, tens of thousands of different proteins in every cell doing the processes of life. Almost all pesticides, almost all pharmaceutical drugs for that matter, work by directly interacting with proteins. Now, DNA represents a sort of recipe book for the construction of these proteins, and that's why DNA is so important. But DNA isn't converted directly into protein. There's an intermediate called messenger RNA, which chemically speaking is very similar to DNA. So similar, in fact, that some viruses actually use RNA as their genetic material rather than DNA, including the coronavirus that's circulating around at the moment, in fact. And in order to try and combat these RNA-based viruses, all higher cells, including humans and plants and insects and so on, have evolved a kind of immune system which recognizes viral RNA and tries to destroy it before it can do any harm. And what we've learned to do is to sort of trick this immune system into thinking that natural messenger RNA is in fact derived from a virus and hence destroying it. And if it's destroyed, of course, the protein is never produced in the first place. So this is a completely new way of intervening in biological systems. So let me show you a quick video here, and I'll explain what you're looking at. So on the right-hand side, well, you're looking at two potato plants growing in pots that have been highly infested with Colorado potato beetle larvae. The one on the right has just been sprayed with water. That's the untreated control. The one on the left has been treated with a strand of RNA, which contains this trick into trying to dupe the immune system of the Colorado potato beetle. And this is just sitting on the leaf surface at the moment. As the larvae eat into the leaf surface, they'll ingest a tiny amount of this RNA, which is nonetheless enough to have a biological effect. Okay, so let me set this time-lapse video running here. I hope you can see this. With a bit of luck, you might be able to see some movement on the leaves of both plants within the first day or so, as the larvae are moving across. By the time we get to day 2, there's still quite a lot happening on the right-hand side, but there's quite a lot less happening on the left-hand side. And by the time we get to day 3, almost nothing at all is happening on the left-hand side. All of the larvae have been killed, whereas things start to get quite exciting on the right-hand side here as the adult beetles start to emerge. So with a bit of luck, you can see the bigger orangey brown beetles consuming the plant. So as the video moves on, you'll get a very elegant demonstration here of why the Colorado potato beetle is such a feared pest by potato farmers around the world. And of course, your eye is drawn to what's going on over here. But even given that almost biblical level of infestation, this plant on the left-hand side actually survived, which is really good. And the really interesting thing about this is because this active ingredient is based on the sequence of the DNA of the pest, we can make these treatments exquisitely selective, far more selective than a chemical pesticide ever could be. Right, I'll just finish off with one last slide here. I've got to mention the Good Growth Plan, which was a Syngenta initiative which was launched in 2013. And the company set itself 6 objectives, 1 about productivity, 2 about the environment, and 3 about people and social justice and that kind of thing. Now, at the time, this was pretty revolutionary because these objectives were both very specific and highly quantitative as well, which was unusual. And our progress against these targets has been externally audited, and all of the data that we generated has been published under open data standards. So we've been very open about this. It's still got about a year or so to run, but you may be able to read through this slide. But we've already exceeded 3 of these targets, 2 of which were pretty close, the 2 at either end. The only one we're really struggling with, I think, is the one in the middle here, about reaching out to smallholders and improving their productivity by 50%. We've actually reached out to more smallholders than we intended, but actually getting them to improve their productivity that much has been a bit of a struggle. But nonetheless, I think it would take a pretty callous and jaundiced anti-corporate activist to contend that this is not a good thing for Syngenta to be doing. Anyway, as this comes to an end, then Syngenta is about to launch a new good growth plan, same kind of idea, but with a different set of objectives. In fact, we were due to launch a couple of weeks ago, and so today would have been a perfect opportunity for me to talk about this in a bit more detail. Sadly, though, the coronavirus situation has scuppered that launch. We still haven't launched it, so I can't say anything about the details of the challenges that we've set ourselves. Suffice it to say, though, I think they are very much along the same lines as the Cool Farm Alliance. And so when we do finally launch this, then please take a look, because I think you'll find what we're trying to do really quite interesting. Well, in view of the time, I think I will stop there and hand it back to the organisers. Thanks very much for listening.
Dave, many thanks indeed for that. Interesting in the question and answer chat box, there's been a whole flurry of questions and challenges and alternative perspectives around different farming platforms and mechanisms, or the role for organics, and different perspectives on agroecology. And so I think I'm not necessarily for you now, but I think for everyone listening, there's a broader question around sustainability in general and sustainability moving forward, around how do we actually create the dialogue and the narrative that works for all actors in a sector and in an industry to come together to the table and have a breadth of conversation that allows scope and space for all voices to be heard. And I think that becomes an interesting dilemma for the sector moving forward, and actually a broader question for how does the Cool Farm Alliance sit within that and play within offering those different perspectives to come together to help drive the whole sector forward, and start where the different perspectives and views are at the moment, and then gradually move everyone in together in a similar direction. That said, I've got one more poll for you. I'm conscious we're close on time, so what I'm hoping to do is this quick poll and then move to a question and answer session for as many of you who are able to stay. We'll try to answer as many questions as possible in about 5 or 10 minutes, and then we will follow up with all of the questions and answers in a written format that we will share with you. So the poll has started. Thank you, Michaela. So really, it's really asking people to maybe have a say on what the top 3 priorities they see that could help deliver sustainable agriculture over the coming years. We've selected a range. We may not have selected everything. So if not, then please select other and add something into the Q&A box so that we can kind of capture those thoughts. But it'd be very valuable to see your thoughts there. Whilst we leave that up, please carry on with that poll. We'll leave it open, but at the same time, Claire, could I hand over to you for the question and answer session?
Yes, no problem. So like Richard said, we've had loads of questions, which is great. It really means that we've stimulated your thoughts on these topics. So I'm just going to pick off a few questions across the speakers. And then, as with all the other questions, we will respond to them and send out a written address after the conference. So my first question is to Urs. Did you identify some farming practices which substantially and consistently reduce the carbon footprint of milk?
Well, substantially, yes, certainly. A lot of our farms, in terms of their yield, are still fairly low, so there is great potential to increase the yield, which results in improved economics for the farm and obviously also improved carbon footprints. consistently in the sense that this would work on every country and every farming system. No, obviously. And I think that's probably part of the complexity of this exercise. There is no silver bullet that you can apply everywhere. You really have to make it context specific in different countries and in different farming systems.
Great, thank you for that, Urs. My next one is for Karen from Viresco. You identified some key influencers in your presentation, one being driven by consumer demand. Were those 5 influencers in order of influence, I guess greatest first or not? I think there's just some clarity required on that.
Okay, I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint presentation and look at those.
I can answer if you like, Karen.
Oh yeah, okay, go ahead, John.
Yeah, so yes, I think they were kind of roughly in order of influence, I guess. So investors, then CSR, international greenhouse gas agreements, media, and then consumer demand at the bottom. And I actually had a question against consumer demand originally, because it's not quite clear, I guess, how much consumer demand does influence kind of businesses throughout the supply chain. So.
Okay, thank you for that. My next one is for Andrew. You were talking about how Soil Capital is working with Cool Farm Tool. Can you just explain a little bit more about how you are integrating with the CFT?
Yeah, I think the question asked specifically about API connections.
Yeah.
To which the answer is there aren't any at the moment. It's on the to-do list.
Okay.
Simple question, simple answer.
Okay, well, I'll ask you another one then, whilst I'm here. South Asia fertilizer is subsidized. So do you think your tool would work there?
Yeah, in principle, there's no reason why the tool cannot be adapted to different market contexts. In fact, we're doing that right now to bring it to the UK. Clearly, what will change is the impact of different economic levers within different practice scenarios.
Okay, thank you. Dave, great presentation, a very thought-provoking one. Have you considered your model to change food habits? So what could require less use of land or farming?
Meaning the consumer choice around what foods to eat, you mean? Is that
yes, I think that's what the question is referring to. So if we were to change what we ate, how would is that considered in your model?
Well, I wouldn't go as far as to call it a model. I mean, that's probably a little bit too grand, I think. You guys do the modeling. Well, yes, it would. I mean, one of the clear things that could change here is all about meat and protein production. I think that's probably the big elephant in the room, and what we're going to do about that. Are we still going to be eating lots of animals going forward into the future? If so, what's the best way of actually producing those animals? I mean, for me, it's all about what is best when it comes to agriculture. What is the best way of producing sufficient food of sufficient quality whilst minimizing environmental impact at the same time, satisfying the demand of consumers whilst minimizing the effects on the environment? And that's just a horrifically complex question, which is why I really like what Cool Farm Alliance are doing, because you're trying to restore some kind of order to this complexity, enabling people to actually see the true impacts of the interventions that they're making. And that, I think, is one of the key things that we haven't really been doing in the past. We've been kind of guessing as to what kind of impacts our interventions will make. And so I think things like the Cool Farm tool are absolutely vital for us to actually take a rational approach to improving quality, improving quantity, and minimizing impact. And that's essential going forward.
Okay, that's really helpful, thank you. And then a different area, I guess, of food production and food use is then food waste. So how would you see that feeding into the equation? So I guess the idea is that if there's less food wasted, we wouldn't need to produce as much anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. So, I mean, again, it's all part of the same complex equation. You can't really separate these things out, I don't think. No. But again, I can see technology actually helping him in terms of producing foods with longer shelf lives, for instance. You know, there's all sorts of things you can actually do. But in order to, you know, come up with a system which adequately feeds all of the people on the planet and can distribute food to where it's necessary, food of sufficient nutritional quality, you know, it's so complicated that what we're actually trying to do here, pairing all these things apart and treating these things as separate bits that can be individually optimized, and then assuming we can bring them all together and the whole system will therefore be optimized, that's too reductionist for me. I think it's got to be much more integrated. Yeah, definitely. Okay, thank you, Dave. Jake, I think you're still with us. Question for you. What crop yields do you get compared to conventional farming in your region? Is he still there?
I'll pop my video back on because I don't think Jake is with us. I think he's had to go back and spray some crops.
Okay. If you answer that, Richard.
Just very quickly, I mean, as you saw in the demonstration, he increased his yields by 21% by use of good farming, and that was things like soil testing, precision agriculture, variable rate nitrogen, variable rate seeding, and tissue testing, and better crop protection. So he is getting good yields, but very variable across his large farm. He has extremely variable soil types. But I mean, he is one of the country's leading farmers. He's not in the record books for his yields, but he works with a lot of organizations, and he's very, very highly regarded. And anybody who can get 8.7 tons of hard bread wheat, high protein off his type of soil, he's well up there in the upper quartile.
Okay. That's great. Thanks, Richard. We are running over time, so I'm going to close the questions there, and we'll follow up with all those we haven't answered, like I said, in written after the conference. So I'll hand back to you, Richard.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for your questions. I'm conscious there's loads. We will provide a written response to those questions and provide them back to you. I think the poll has been running, has just finished. Michaela's just closed it. It's been running for 9 minutes. So if I share the results, I'm not sure if that is coming up for everybody. Or Michaela, can you share the results for people just so that we can see the outcome? I don't know if we can see it.
It should be shared. It should be shared. You clicked on it, so everybody should see it.
Oh, okay. Okay, if someone's able to pop a comment into the Q&A just to tell me they can see it or not. Yes, thank you. Yep, great, thank you, folks. So there's the results. Just whilst you're having a look at that, Michaela, could I ask you to pop onto the last slide? I'm really grateful to you all for joining us today, and I'm apologetic for running over by 7-8 minutes at the moment, but I am really grateful to you for staying on, and I hope you'll agree we saw a complete range of different aspects of the Alliance and the Cool Farm tool, which was super interesting and hopefully of interest to you. Now, if it is of interest to you and you would like to follow up and have more of a conversation with us around the Cool Farm Alliance, the Cool Farm tool, its possible applications, how it might apply for you, then please get in touch with us. The website, our website, coolfarmtool.org, has a huge amount of information. It also has information about how to join the Alliance and our memberships as well, or alternatively you can contact us directly by emailing support@coolfarmtool.org, and so please do that to get in touch. At the same time, please don't inundate us, so if you do get in touch, we will get back to you as soon as we can, and as I said at the beginning, we'll provide the materials as much as we're able to from the content today. We'll provide that back to you in one form or another, probably through the website at some point over the coming days and weeks. But once again, thank you very much. We'll leave the Q&A open for a little bit longer So if you do have any final questions, do pop them in there and then we will include them in our written response. Thank you very much, everyone.